بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. This is our second session on looking at the path of seeking Islamic knowledge, what to study, how to study, and why we study. What are the maqasid of ta'aleem, of ta'allum and ta'aleem? What are the aims of studying, and what are the fruits in one's own life and in being of service to others? So the second part is what to study. Right? And this is building on what we took in the first session. A lot of people ask about what should I study, and the basic principle returns to those three stages of learning. Right? The three stages of learning being, as Imam al-Ghazali outlined, Haddul Iqtisar, which is the essentials. Iqtasara, qasr is to shorten, right? Iqtisar is sort of limited. Iqtisar is limiting oneself to the basics, right? And we looked at that and how that is achieved. In each subject, it is by studying a basic text in the subject, what would be called a primer, a matan. Typically, some primers are so short that they may be studied with a brief commentary. Then there's the second stage, which is called Haddul Iqtisad with a dal, which is iqtasada, from is intermediate level, which is understanding. And then there's mastery. Haddul istiqsa. Istiqsa, to go to the ends of something. And mastery at one level is unattainable. Right? Because al-ulum, they are abhur bila sahil, right? They are seas without shore, right? Although some have claimed that their works are the ocean itself, right? Many have claimed that. There's many, because of this idea of mastery and knowledge being an ocean, many claim that their work is the ocean. Al-Bahr al-Muhit, for example, of Abu Hayyan in Tafsir, called the encompassing ocean. And Al-Qamus al-Muhit tried to encompass the Arabic language in intermediate size by Al-Firuzabadi. Many others talked about the knowledge being an ocean. Al-Haskafi in Hanafi Fiqh, he simply said about his book, فَمَنْ أَتْقَنَ كِتَابِ هَذَا فَهُوَ الْفَقِيهُ الْمَاهِرُ. Whoever masters this book of mine, they are the expert jurist. لِأَنَّهُ هُوَ الْبَحْرُ, because this is the ocean. لَكِنْ بِلَا سَاحِلٍ, but without any shores. Of course, he's pointing to, because before, Ibn Nujaym, a great Hanafi jurist of the 10th century, wrote a book called Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, the overwhelming ocean, right? Or the upswelling ocean, which was meant to be the oceanic reference for legal details in the school. But then his younger brother wrote a book called An-Nahr al-Fa'iq, the river that flows over, right? That goes over, that exceeds. This may be a river. It was a third of the size of his older brother's book. One was Najm ibn Nujaym, Zayn ibn Nujaym, al-Bahr al-Ra'iq. The other, his younger brother, Umar ibn Nujaym, student of the older brothers, wrote Al-Nahr al-Fa'iq. Yours is the upswelling ocean, but this is a river, but it's fa'iq. It goes over the ocean. But the nature of knowledge is that, alhamdulillah, our ulama have served the sciences of the deen in its preservation, and there isn't any one path to the goal of learning, understanding, or mastery. Just in brief, just to give you some pointers, there's some key reference works on the adab, on seeking knowledge, that also touch upon what one studies and how. And these are works that should be in the arsenal of any student of knowledge. Imam Zarnuji's Ta'lim al-Muta'allim is brief and therefore often studied. We're reading it, of course, in the daily Rawha, Mondays to Thursdays here at the Hub. It's being podcast. It's a separate, distinct podcast. Imam Ghazali's Book of Knowledge from the Ihya, which is now translated by Ustaz Abdul Hadi Honorkamp, Kenneth Honorkamp. And we have a number of explanations of it by very distinguished scholars, amongst them Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqubi and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in full, and Sheikh Nuh Keller he taught it in full as well. If you're able to find a copy of that, then haniyan lak. Habib Omar's Maqasid Halaqat al-Ta'lim, which is translated by our dear Ustaz Amjad Tarsin. And there's a great gem by a very interesting Ottoman scholar, Sajiqli Zada, that wasn't actually his name. His name was Abdurrahman al-Marashli, but Sajiqli Zada has got a book called Tertibul Ulum, How the Sciences Are Ordered, which is brilliant. A PDF of this is online. That's quite detailed and technical, but it's a great work. Sometimes authors did not actually agree with their own books. Sajiqli Zada wrote a brilliant book in theology, which is an unbelievably useful reference, called Nashr al-Tawali'. When he talks about the study of theology, he says, and in the vigor of my youth, I authored a book in this subject called Nashr al-Tawali'. But now I have renounced this science, as Ghazali and others also renounced it before me. And if I could gather all copies of this book and burn it, I would do so. But alas, it has spread across the lands. فَإِلَى اللَّهِ الْمُشْتَكَى. So one complains only to Allah. And وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. And of course, his book was taught from his lifetime right up till that great demolition job called Islahul Azhar, the reform of the Azhar, starting in the early 20th century. Actually, starting from the late 19th century, the progressive attempted destruction of Al-Azhar, and inshallah, its revival, which has sort of been sputtering along in recent years, with some significant steps and some meanderings. Inshallah, will improve things. And of course, very important, the counsel and guidance of your mentor teachers, and we talked about the importance of mentors. So first, to look at what are the key sciences, the ulama said that there's broadly two types of sciences. There's the instrumental sciences, ulumul ala, and the core instrumental sciences are four. Three sciences of language, nahu, sarf, and balagha, and mantiq, logic. Nahu, which is grammar, sarf is morphology, balagha is rhetoric, mantiq is logic. And we covered a session previously on the importance of the instrumental sciences, and it's somewhat detailed lesson, and it wouldn't hurt you to listen to that or review that. It's on the Seekers Hub YouTube channel. Inshallah, Sidi Amr will send that out to those who are in this class. Then there's the core Islamic sciences, and these are called the ulum al-maqsuda. These are sciences that are sought in of themselves. Of these, four are the main core sciences, which are Aqida, the science of Islamic beliefs, Fiqh, Islamic law, Hadith, and by Hadith here we mean Hadith, the actual works of the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, as opposed to the science of Hadith, and Tafsir, right? Qur'anic exegesis, to understand revelation. And there are four, sorry, I'm bad with numbers, and there's three corollary supporting sciences: usul al-fiqh, the principles of legal interpretation; usul al-hadith, the principles of the science of the hadith sciences; and ulum al-Qur'an, the sciences of the Qur'an. And we look at what these are, because these support the main sciences. Technically, mantiq could be seen as a supporting science, in that it supports above all the science of Aqeedah, but it's an instrumental science because it just supports sound thinking in general. Though increasingly one is convinced by the critique of logic that it's a science that the intelligent don't need and fools would not benefit from. And then there are other sciences that are considered, that weren't traditionally studied formally, but across the Ummah, the great the great educating scholars have advocated and their inclusion in a curriculum of formal study, because there's some things that are meant to be part of the natural upbringing of a believer, and that are inculcated in them through the company that they keep. And these are the science of Sirah and Shama'il, because those, growing up as a Muslim, it would be a given that he's your prophet, know about him, right? So it's a given. Shaykh al-Yaqubi said this is something that you learn growing up as a child, and that you study with a cup of coffee or tea. Right? It's straightforward. It's manifest and evident and something that's inculcated through company and through one's knowledge and practice is da'wah, right? Calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as Imam Laqani says regarding the need to write shorter works, he says, وَلَكِنْ مِنَ التَّطْوِيلِ كَلَّتِ الْهِمَمْ فَصَارَ فِيهِ الِاخْتِصَارُ مُلْتَزَمْ. Says, however, due to the lengthy nature of the works of the science, resolves began weakening and fraying, so it became necessary to author abridged works. That's what he does. But some study of these in the context of a curriculum is also important. And then there's another science that typically was left to, because the science itself is not about formal study, but it is about, above all, personal change through practice and guidance, which is the science of tasawwuf, the science of Islamic spirituality. But again, because of the disconnect that modern living has, and disintegrated societies where people don't have integrated living with the mosque as the focal point of the community, with madrasas and zawiyas as the pillars of a community, people living apart, etc. Then, this is the study of this in a curricular sense is also, and spirituality is above all a lived science, but it also has a study element. And the ulama have increasingly sought to bring that in to their curricula. Okay, so this is sort of the breakdown of the sciences. We'll look at each of these sciences just briefly. However, of course, note that the order mentioned here is not canonical, right? That different teachers, different syllabi, different circumstances could entail replacing some texts for the other. Right? And in general, if what you're seeking is sufficiency, like gaining what's enough for you to practice your deen, maybe be able to benefit others, then having a solid foundation, that essentials level, is enough. If you're a student of knowledge, then you should strive to reach at least some level of understanding. And understanding has degrees. Some others have broken the curriculum instead of 3 stages into 5 steps. And we'll share a more nuanced breakdown of this, because one could break the essentials stage down into 2 steps. Complete basics, and then having a foundational understanding. Then the understanding stage, you have basic understanding, intermediate understanding, and sort of upper intermediate understanding. And then mastery is like specialization, right? But conceptually, the science of Aqida, the science of Islamic beliefs, its purpose is sound belief, understanding, defending and proving of the beliefs of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, of the people of the prophetic way and mainstream of the community. Of course, its purpose is not the perfection of faith, right? So the science of faith does not make, or should not make, the claim that it is the means to perfect faith. Rather, the scholars of this science, who are fair, it is generally the case, will say that faith does increase, but it increases not through study, but through living the meanings and implications of faith. Imam Laqani says in Jawharat al-Tawheed, وَرُجِّحَتْ زِيَادَةُ الْإِيمَانِ بِمَا تَزِيدُ طَاعَةُ الْإِنسَانِ. It is chosen that faith increases by all that increases a person's state of obedience to Allah. So, Iman increases through Islam and Ihsan, through submission and through science of submission, and through active submission and active striving for spiritual excellence. وَنَقْصُهُ بِنَقْصِهَا. And its diminishment is by its diminishment, by the diminishment of one's state of submission. So the essentials, which is to study a primer in the subject, and there's many great primers written on this subject. the Tahawiyya is quite popular, especially in recent times. That was seen classically more as a clear early statement of Islamic beliefs. The Kharida of Imam al-Dardir, which is what we have taught at Seekers, and there's other similar level texts as well. Right? These cover what we believe at a foundational level. The Tahawiyya has benefits of clarity and reinforcing key principles. The Kharida has benefits, particularly it looks at key first principles related to Islamic belief and presenting a method by which to inoculate and understand and defend beliefs, it's an amazing work. So that's for student knowledge. That's a starting point, and then in building understanding, there's Imam al-Ghazali's Qawa'id al-Aqaid, which is book 2 of the Ihya, which we covered last year at the Hub, and it's available as a course online. It's somewhat lengthy, it's 30-something classes, but it covers a lot of very important principles. And in some ways, it serves for both essentials and understanding, in that he begins by covering a brief presentation of Islamic beliefs, and then he covers a number of key investigations related to how we approach the study of the science of Islamic beliefs, how we place it in the Islamic sciences and in our lives, and a number of cautions related to not getting mind heavy, because faith is not a matter of the mind, faith is a matter of the heart. The mind, the aql, the intellect, aql is from iqal, it's a restraint. It ties down, so it restrains, it keeps things in place, it protects from deviation, right? It sets limits that don't. This is the fortress of Ahl Sunnah. Get out of here, right? But that's not, so not to get too infatuated with it, because the castle is not just about the walls, right? So as beautiful as the castle itself is, the king is within, right? And the guardians, while they play an important role, they're just at the gates, right? Of course, the theologians would mind that big time, but there's also other works at a level of understanding, commentaries on the great later works of great later summaries of Aqeedah, such as Sharh Jawharat al-Tawheed. Jawharat al-Tawheed is 100, the Kharida is about 70 lines. What, 71? 71 lines. Jawharat al-Tawheed of Imam Laqani, which is with a qaf without a shadda. It's not Laqani, it's Laqani, although most people make a mistake in that. But it's not a big mistake. You can forgive anyone who does that. There may be difference of opinion on it, though I haven't seen proof yet. But most people don't think, so it doesn't matter. The Sharh al-Jawhara, the Jawharat al-Tawheed of Imam al-Laqani has a number of commentaries. He himself wrote commentaries. He wrote 3 commentaries. His son wrote a commentary, and it's a brilliant work, but it details out the beliefs, but in a relatively brief manner. There's many great commentaries on it, amongst them Imam Sawi's commentary, and the commentary of the great Shaykh al-Azhar, Imam al-Bajuri, Imam Ibrahim al-Bajuri. And that should be sufficient. Studying, and the more one consolidates at the level of understanding, it's helpful. If someone studied, just as at the essential one studied both the Tahawiyya and the Kharida, it helps. The Sanusiyya, Imam As-Sanusi was one of the great 10th century Islamic scholars. He wrote a whole slew of great works, great concise works in Islamic beliefs. And so he wrote a Sughra. But then he wanted to write something shorter than that, because he called it Sughra Sughra. Or he wrote Al-Muqaddimat, he wrote Al-Wusta, which is also called Al-Barahin, the foundational proofs, which is what became famous as a Sanusiyya. He also wrote Al-Kubra. So he has a whole slew of core texts. They're all brilliant and they all reinforce each other. But the Sanusiyya itself, the foundational proofs, this is a brilliant presentation of the core proofs related to, core rational proofs related to Islamic beliefs. But this is only studied after one has, ideally or properly, after one has studied logic and after one has gained some sense and sensibility about one's religion, because otherwise it can give you a toxic rational shock, right? TRS, which is quite dangerous. Which is why, and if someone were in a completely pristine and preserved environment, there's no need to study the Sanusiyya. So Imam al-Haddad actually said that in our times, it's prohibited to teach the Sanusiyya, even for students of knowledge. But he was talking in the valley of Hadramaut, where, because if you're in a place where you'll never see a non-Muslim, and if you're in an environment where there's no people of innovation around, then, and no one doubts belief in God, then why would you need to defend that which is in no need of defense? You'll just cause unnecessary confusion. Because most people don't, and given that most people don't think anyways, right? Like a theologian would say that most Muslims should not be Muslims. Why? Because why would a rational person believe something if they don't know why they believe it? And they don't know why it's sound? Because the basis is al-asl, al-asl al-adam. The basis is non-affirmation. So why would you affirm anything? لا ترجيح إلا بمرجح. There's no preponderation without a cause of preponderation. So why would you affirm A? Because there's a reason. Now, the reality is, of course, the human being is not a rational animal, not merely a rational animal. So people believe because their parents believe, because of socialization, because of all these other causes. Just as they disbelieve because of a whole bunch of non-rational causes. But thankfully, people are generally heedless and unthinking. So most Muslims do believe, or pretty much all Muslims believe, which a theologian would be amazed by, but they would say that makes no sense. But they wouldn't talk too much about it. They'd be very troubled that they need to learn why they believe what they believe. But other people say, just chill out. But on the scales of justice and mercy, the theologians are very much on the side of justice. And the third is mastery, which of course in any subject is without limits, but the beginnings of mastery after proper study of these previous things would be Imam Taftazani's Sharh al-Aqaid. And they say, "Man lam yaqra Sharh al-Aqaid, falam yaqra al-Aqaid." Whoever hasn't studied Sharh al-Aqaid hasn't studied Aqaid. Aqaid being plural, because you can say it's science of Islamic belief, because belief is a singular concept. Belief is not a composite concept. It's just a singular matter. Right? You believe in Allah, everything else is consequences of that. But it's aqa'id, science of Islamic beliefs, because the points of belief are many. What you believe in, al-mu'taqad, there's many things that one believes. And of course, and then there's, mastery in any subject, so we won't keep reiterating, entails delving into and being familiar with the major works in the subject, and of course, with something like the science of Islamic belief, given its role in defending and proving Islamic beliefs, application to contemporary challenges to both intellectual and scientific and so on to belief. But and some people need to specialize in this. Not all people, not all students of knowledge. For most people, going beyond intermediate understanding can be detrimental or distracting. And of course, one has to, at a personal level, prioritize faith itself, right, with the health of one's faith through practice and spirituality. And the scholars of Aqida itself make that very clear. And one has to also beware of not making argument and disputation one's habit, right? Because that's very dangerous. Any questions here? Yes?
So at each of the stages when one is studying these texts, does one also study a commentary, or is that something?
What one studies is what was suggested, right? Now, while studying a particular text, there's supporting texts and so on, such as, that's why the commentaries were generally written to support the understanding of the text itself. So in some cases, a text would be studied, so it can help to have supporting commentaries, which one consults one's teachers, and different teachers teach with different emphases, just like different professors teach the same subject with different emphases in terms of what is recommended reading and recommended preparation for class. I know in some technical subjects, some of the scholars actually take in writing that you cannot prepare from any of the commentaries, because they want you to come with a clear mind and they want to teach the core concepts to you with clarity. Others, if you don't come prepared, say, go back home. Okay. They'll just begin, and if in the first issue, if there isn't a question, they'll say, go home. Okay. And that's because learning is a training, and there's different methods in training. Go ahead.
Just wanted to know what the definition of balagha was.
Well, we're coming to it. The science of rhetoric is a science of eloquence in expression and in appreciating eloquence.
So for the Sanusi, you have given a prerequisite of having to have covered some sort of mantiq. What about the other texts? Are there any prerequisites, or is it generally,
Okay, so there's an order in the study of each subject, right? But the Sanusiya itself, given that it's very proof heavy. It's written. It's called Barahin, the foundational proofs. Its real purpose is to cover the core arguments related to how we affirm each of the beliefs related to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the science of constructing proofs is logic. So, you'd need that unless one's doing it just for sort of educational tourism, right? The purpose of fiqh is sound practice, sound submission, to be in a state of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, soundly, properly, in praiseworthy ways, in every aspect of one's lived practice. At the level of essentials, and of course we're just going to talk about two schools. If you're Maliki, consult your Maliki teachers. If you don't have a teacher and you're Maliki, then you're just you. But just remember, there's Maliki Yawmuddin, right, who'll judge you for whatever you're up to. The fuqaha consider themselves the policemen of this ummah. And sometimes they can get overzealous in their role, like policemen are sometimes given to do. But the existence of police brutality does not negate the benefit of the institution of policing. So, and there are limits to police authority, and likewise the fuqaha sometimes have to be told, okay. But they have to be taken very seriously, and really the core, the science that affects you most in your day-to-day practically is fiqh, right? And in most curricula, the largest amount of time spent on any given science is on fiqh. And some people criticize that. I spent some days with a very intriguing traditional modernist scholar in Indonesia, and when discussing, okay, what's the curriculum of studying the ulum al-shari'iyya, the Sharia sciences in the traditional pasantarans, the madrasas of Indonesia, which are very much rooted in the method of the ulama of Hadramaut. He said, we don't study the ulum al-shari'iyya, we don't study the shari'i sciences. I said, really? What? He said, we just study the ulum al-fiqhiyya, we just study fiqh. There's a couple of other things that come up on the way, but that's an exaggeration. But so for essentials, studying the absolute essentials, assent to felicity in Shafi'i fiqh, al-Risala al-Jami'a, and perhaps one other text, gives you grounding in the essentials. In terms of understanding, one studies at least, sort of basic understanding is studying one complete book in all the chapters of fiqh properly, right? And that amount is really practically required for any Muslim. If you're serious about your religion and you haven't studied one text of fiqh cover to cover, like across all the chapters of fiqh, then you're just just dazed and confused. And because if you don't know what Allah has made His servants obligated with respect to, then how can you know whether you're in a state of obedience to Allah or not? Right? And so studying that's sort of basic basic understanding of religion, of the practice of religion, requires studying a complete work of fiqh, cover to cover, or the equivalent thereof, right? In many lands, the ulama gathered sort of comprehensive works on practical guidance of religion related to the various facets of one's life that affect the common person. But in terms of formal study, one studies a matan, right? A primer that covers all the various chapters of life. So not just worship, but also personal law, marriage, divorce, and related matters, commercial transactions, contracts, and the various derivatives. And these are needed by anybody. And it's not just in terms of preserving guidance, but also in terms of, a lot of people miss out on obvious opportunities in life because they don't know what the limits are. So they err on the side of caution. Fascinatingly, a manual for women living in, semi-educated women, or almost uneducated women in the beginning of the 20th century, has detailed guide on how to have partnership contracts, how to invest, etc. Why? Because any rational human being, although how few they are, if you're a stay-at-home mother, if you're a rational human being, you'd consider the reality that your husband might die, or something could happen. So what are you going to do then? You should have some kind of way of having, your own economic well-being. So you'd secure that. One is either to enter into an agreement with your husband so that you have a share of his wealth, and if that's enough, then, but you'd think about, your worldly interests and securing them as part of securing your ultimate interests. So, those chapters of fiqh aren't, and even other matters on public law. Public law, say, well, I'm never going to be a qadi. But the public law establishes principles of justice. Right? How you establish proof. And that applies in day-to-day relationships too. So someone comes and says something to you about somebody, but if you study the principles of public justice, of how a proof is established in court, how arguments are heard, etc., that applies to one's day-to-day life. Two people are in dispute, you know how to judge between them, you know how to arbitrate between them, and how to mediate between them. That's practically needed in families. And if you can be the person who can rectify, either through adjudication or arbitration or mediation, you're a source of great good. And even just to judge on a personal level, someone comes and says something, there are principles of whose word do you accept, and what applies in court applies in daily living too. So these are all needed. The principles of international law, which is often called asir, which are covered in the books of fiqh, establish questions that a lot of people have about jihad, about is Islam trying to take over the world, etc. And just say, no, it's not. Well, you'd be surprised, right? If you haven't studied it properly. So, but then to cover a commentary on a primer consolidates that understanding. So, the same in Shafi'i fiqh. If one studies Matn bi Shuja', then the commentary on Matn bi Shuja', which is Sharh ibn Qasim. And if one studies Quduri, a Sharh on Quduri. This is consolidation of understanding. And then completion of understanding, one studies a more detailed matn, a more detailed summary text, which is like Kanz al-Daqa'iq, the treasure chest of secrets, of subtleties, by Imam al-Nasafi, the author of the great Tafsir as well, Imam Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi, or Umdat al-Salik, which, lo and behold, is available in English. And if one does these properly, right, so depending on where one wants to be in the spectrum of understanding, just at a level of personal, more refined personal understanding, one studies just the matan. One wants to consolidate that understanding, to be able to teach that understanding to others. One studies a commentary. If one's a student of knowledge, one needs to go beyond that, ideally, as well. But even if one studies a commentary here, sort of the intermediate understanding step, one could teach people beyond the basics. But one is still not got deep understanding such that one doesn't understand all the intricacies and nuances, which is what another text on top of that consolidates that. And if one stopped here, and there's, these are not etched in stone, there are other such texts, one would be safe and sound as a student of knowledge. Someone who studied even the intermediate level in these has some footing in the study of fiqh, and they could be of benefit to people. Fiqh is a lifetime endeavor. One of the things that is between essentials and understanding in both the Shafi'i school and the Hanafi school is studying a detailed primer on worship. Studying a detailed primer on worship, which has a lot of practical benefit for oneself in that one understands the nuances of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala outwardly. And it has a lot of benefits because with respect to teaching, because most of what people wonder about in their religious practice relates to their worship. And for that, in the Hanafi school, you have Nur al-Idah, and in the by Imam Shurun Bulali as well. In the Shafi school, you have this work called Al-Muqaddimah Al-Hadramiyya. And these fall between essentials and understanding, depending on how you study them. Right? Because at the level of detail, they're more detailed than most of the books covered at the level of understanding. And then there's mastery, which is really for specialization. Classically, the final book studied in a Hanafi madrasa would be the Hidayah of Al-Marghinani. The Hanafis had a love relationship with this book. They said, some even wrote poetry. There's a lot of poetry written in praise of the Hidayah. إن الهداية كالقرآن قد نسخت ما جاء قبلها في الشرع من كتبي. The Hidayah, like the Quran, abrogated what came before it in sacred law of books. فقرأها ودرسها يحفظ قولك من زيغ ومن زلل. So study it and memorize it, and your words will be protected from error and from stumbling and from deviance. And some said, "Man fatathu al-hidayah, faqad fatathu al-hidayah." Whoever misses out on the hidayah has missed out on hidayah, on guidance. But that's overstatement, of course. And Haskafi's Durr al-Mukhtar, Imam Marghinani's hidayah is based on understanding the legal reasoning of the school. So this is called طريقة التفقه. Imam Haskafi's Durr al-Mukhtar is طريقة الفتوى. Right? It's focused on understanding what's the fatwa in the school and the legal details. And in fiqh, there are these two approaches to fiqh. Right? There's the legal understanding and there's the legal application. Right? So the faqih can be seen as the one who has legal understanding, but the mufti is the one who has the capacity to apply the law. And sometimes the one applying the law is not that interested in what's the theoretical underpinning about it, that the reasoning behind it. Look, I need to answer people's questions. Just leave me alone. And the faqih often is just interested in theoretically, this is how things are. So and ideally, someone would have both, right? But some minds are more inclined towards legal reasoning and the theoretical. Others are more inclined towards the practical. And in Shafi'i fiqh, the Minhaj of Imam al-Nawawi and its commentaries such as Sharh al-Mahalli, which is arguably the greatest commentary on the Minhaj when it comes to the legal reasoning aspect. And there's other great commentaries on the Minhaj. And at this level, works are studied on Usul al-Ifta, on the principles of fatwa. And there's other derivative sciences related to fiqh, such as Qawa'id al-Fiqh, the legal maxims, etc. There's many, specialized things that could be studied separately, and But this is just to understand the core emphasis. Third, the science of hadith, or ilm al-hadith, right, is basic. The purpose is to know the sunnah, to know the way of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? And a lot of this has to do with personal effort as well. Right? Some of this is studied within the curriculum, but this is one of those areas that also needs to be a personal knowledge commitment. At the level of essentials, to have studied the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, Mukhtar al-Hadith, or a similar text. Mukhtar al-Hadith is by Habib Omar, and there's other brief texts like that that give you a representative sampling of the Sunnah. There's a beautiful work by a distinguished hadith, 20th century Indian hadith scholar, called Zad al-Talibin, Provisions for Seekers, which is also translated into English. It was also designed, it's about 300 hadiths, mostly very brief, and it was designed in a manner to facilitate memorization, but also to facilitate the study of the Arabic language. Very interesting, because meant for madrasa students. There's many texts at this level, but we need to, at the level of understanding, right, to have deeper appreciation for the Sunnah. Riyadh al-Salihin, the Gardens of the Righteous, which that focuses above all on character and conduct. Above all, character and conduct, proprieties and virtues. But there's also need to have a legal appreciation for the Sunnah, on the Sunnah as law. Right? And the Muwatta of Imam Malik was the great foundational work on that. And there's of course not one Muwatta. Imam Malik taught the Muwatta for years and years. And every time he taught it, he transmitted it slightly differently. In that he had a large collection of hadiths, and he'd add or subtract each time he taught it according to different considerations. So there's many different narrations of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. One is the most famous, sort of the default narration, or became the default. There's a lot of argument which is the greatest narration, the most important narration, the most reliable narration, the most comprehensive narration. And of course, there's a Hanafi narration of the Muwatta of Imam Malik, because amongst those who studied the Muwatta of Imam Malik was Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, the great student of Imam Abu Hanifa, and that's often known as Muwatta Muhammad. Right? And the Hanafis have a love relationship with that Muwatta. But studying, and the Muwatta is useful because it's not that long. It's just slightly over 1,000 hadiths. Right? Depending how you number them, and which narration you're talking about. But studying the Muwatta of Imam Malik, or its narration by Imam Muhammad, or Mishkatul Masabih of At-Tabrizi. Mishkatul Masabih, the niche of lamps, is really a summary or summation of the core hadiths of the 6 books and beyond. Because he looked at what are the, in each chapter of the, in the books of hadith were arranged like the books of fiqh. And in each chapter he looks at what are the hadiths related by Bukhari and Muslim, what are the hadiths related in other than Bukhari and Muslim of the 6 books, and key hadiths from beyond that. Each chapter is divided into 3 parts. It's about slightly over 5,000 hadiths, so it's lengthy. But from his time, the Mishkatul Masabih was taught in higher years in madrasa curricula, and it's still taught. It's still part of the curriculum in Indian madrasas and elsewhere. But these are things that one, even if one's not dedicated, full-time student, all these are things that one can approach through personal study as well, right? And the way longer texts are also covered at a personal level is over time. The power of consistency. So Shaykh Nuh, Mishkat al-Masabih is by At-Tabrizi. He took a work called Masabih al-Sunnah by al-Baghawi. Now al-Baghawi also has many other, he was a great Imam of Hadith, a great Shafi'i jurist, al-Baghawi, and author of a brilliant tafsir. Al-Baghawi also has a book called Masabih al-Sunnah. That was the work from which the Mishkat al-Masabih was taken. He has another work called Sharh al-Sunnah, which is about 4,300 hadiths. Sharh al-Sunnah, Shaykh Nuh was reading one hadith a day in Amman of Sharh al-Sunnah, and over a period of 12 years, they completed the whole collection, 4,300 and something hadiths. And that's the power of consistency. Just one hadith a day. And that's how one studies these kinds of longer works, even at a personal level. If someone's serious about the deen, you have to know the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And mastery is studying the 6 books of hadith with understanding, with, bringing together the studying of hadith with the others, with the sciences of hadith that underlie it, etc. And that's a lifetime endeavor of specialization. There's also, of course, in the Indian subcontinent, there's a brilliant, but sometimes human beings tend towards forms rather than meanings. You have to beware of formalism, because forms are important, but it is meanings that matter, right? So, a lot of people say, I studied the Hidayah, but do you know it? No. It doesn't, what counts, العبرة في الشرع للمعاني وليست لمجرد المباني. What counts in the Sharia is meanings, not mere forms. Right? So, studying the 6 books is good, but if it is preceded by that which would prepare you for it, in the science of hadith and in the related sciences. Because studying the 6 books without knowing the other Islamic sciences, you won't know what's going on. How can you say, I studied the chapter on divorce in the books of hadith, but you don't know the fiqh of divorce, right? It doesn't make sense. Because in reality, all the Islamic sciences, the instrumental sciences and the other main sciences, including Islamic beliefs and fiqh and usul, and etc., all of them are to be able to understand the Qur'an and Sunnah. That applies to the study of hadith, and it also applies, of course, to study of tafsir, whose purpose is understanding the Book of Allah. At the level of essentials, there's a personal endeavor. It may be taught in a curriculum, or it may not be. Study the tafsir of the Fatiha, and at the very least the short surahs, the last 10 surahs, beginning with the last 10 surahs. Studying the tafsir of the 30th juz, the commonly recited surahs, Mulk, Waqi'ah, Yasin, Kahf, because these are things that are supposed to be part of our devotional practice. Someone should know what they mean in some depth. And normally this wouldn't properly, in classical curriculum, this wouldn't be part of, this is something that's a devotion, this is not seeking formal knowledge, this is part of one's devotional commitment. But things like that can't be assumed always. So, then at the level of understanding, studying a brief tafsir of the Qur'an. At the very least, reading it, right? Reading it at a personal level. But in many curricula, they'd go through Tafsir al-Jalalain, for example, or some other tafsir. And also, so really, one concern is to familiarize oneself with the method of tafsir, to cover a certain amount of tafsir using classical sources, so that one is able now to soundly access the different types of books of tafsir. So one has a taste for tafsir, because there's different methods in the sciences of tafsir as is presented in ulum al-Quran, in the sciences of the Quran, so that one knows, okay, these are the various ways of approaching tafsir, because there's tafsir by transmission, there's linguistic tafsir, there's legal tafsir, there are comprehensive works of tafsir, there are spiritually inclined works of tafsir, there's a number of different, there's theological tafsir. So to gain familiarity with these various modes, especially for student knowledge, so that they are able to access the classical works of tafsir soundly. And so there's a lot of work that can be done in this respect. And then mastery, of course, is to become a specialist. That, of course, there's requirements for that. You need to have mastery of the Arabic language. Right? That's the foundation. You have to have mastery of the Arabic language. You have to have trained in the sciences related to this, what's called ulum al-Quran, which you'll be looking at when you look at the supporting sciences. You need to understand usul al-fiqh. Well, you need to be well grounded in all the Islamic sciences, because tafsir is interpreting the word of Allah. But to interpret the word of Allah, you need to know the sciences of this religion. So they cannot, by definition, be a mufassir who doesn't know theology reliably. You cannot have a mufassir, a scholar of tafsir. But how many in the modern time don't? You cannot do tafsir of Quran if you don't know fiqh in detail. You cannot do tafsir of the Quran if you're not well versed in hadith, because a key, the most basic way of tafsir is tafsir through transmission. So you know the other verses that highlight the same meaning, because the verses of the Quran explain each other. And second is tafsir by transmission, by hadith. But if you can't distinguish between what's a sound hadith and an unsound hadith, and you don't know the science of hadith, then what are you doing tafsir? Etc. So, and in that, of course, a simple thing is, it's an innovation of this age that people, doesn't matter how nice, intelligence alone is not a condition for teaching any Islamic science. Being an intelligent extrovert is not, that's well, two conditions. Neither is a condition. Because you could be a dull person who's just saying, well, this is what the ulama say, and they're a CDP, right? Certified dull person, okay? Better to have a certified dull person than a brilliant deviant, right? So you have to be very careful. It's from the innovations of, I was just walking, a musalla that I normally avoid, I was just walking out of it, and some auntie is teaching tafsir, and she doesn't even know Arabic. I know she doesn't know Arabic, and she doesn't claim to know Arabic. Dars tafsir with so on. Right? The most sensitive Islamic science is, because the whole basis of the preservation of our deen is the Qur'an. Right? So anything that's related to Qur'an is taken far more seriously than anything else. Right? And everything else is a means to understanding the command of Allah, right? Which is why most classical curricula actually don't cover very much in tafsir at all, because all of study could be seen as a means. Now you can approach the Book of Allah in terms of understanding and interpretation. Okay? In understanding and appreciation. Right? But in terms of study, mastery requires deep study of longer works of tafsir. Right? and appreciating the methodologies of the scholars of tafsir, but it requires, at least deep understanding of all the other Islamic sciences. Perhaps not mastery of them, but deep, certified understanding. And then there are the supporting sciences, right? So we said of the main sciences, there's the core sciences. Of the core sciences, there's the main ones, which are Aqida, Fiqh, Hadith, and Qur'an. And then there's supporting sciences. The supporting sciences, one is Usul al-Fiqh, the science of legal interpretation. How law is derived from revelation. The scholars of Usul al-Fiqh would say, our science is the key to all the other sciences. Because if you don't know where you get, because the principles by which you derive, these are the principles not really of fiqh, but these are the principles of sound derivation of meanings from texts. And so the scholars of usul there's a danger in usul al-fiqh to have an inflated ego. Right? When I got to Damascus, one of the students asked, a very respected scholar, what should I study in usul al-fiqh? He said, before you study usul al-fiqh, take care of your ego, because usul has a tendency to inflate the ego. Right? So beware. Why? Because these are the principles by which so if the scholar of usul al-fiqh could argue with the faqih, say, look, you guys just talking about legal details. I know how these legal details are derived. So, I'm a judge over you. Said, you could say to the scholar of Aqida that you're arguing about what we believe. I know how these beliefs are derived from the primary text. So go back to your place. They can tell the scholar of Hadith, you're reading the Hadith, I know what they mean. Right? Tafsir, so you're just talking, you're just sort of dancing around divine guidance. I know the meanings that are derived from it. Right? I am the authority on how these meanings are derived. What you're talking about is just sort of decorative understanding, deriving consequential meanings. That's my skill. Of course, all of them would go back. It said, unless you're a faqih, don't talk about fiqh. Unless you're a theologian, don't claim that you can derive sound meanings. Because you know the theory of the derivation of meanings. We know practically what are the derived meanings. And of course, that's not how it works. Sound understanding brings all these things together. Right? But this is very dangerous. You can, one of my teachers, it's a good place to be in, but it's not good adab. One of my teachers has been calling me for several days that, please, I need to talk to you. And I know what he wants to talk to me about. It's very complicated. So I've been waiting for this weekend to I'll probably call him after this class. May Allah help. And I hope it's not Taimur's fault, because Taimur went and saw him last weekend. So he said, مِمَّا ابْتَلَانِ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِهِ, said, from what Allah tried and tested me with, في طلبي للعلم أني بدأت في العلم بقراءة أصول الفقه. He said, from the tribulations in my seeking of knowledge is that I began seeking knowledge by studying usul al-fiqh. So he said, فشعرت نفسي حاكما على العلوم. So I considered myself to be a judge over all the Islamic sciences. I know how all of this is derived. So he went to Shaykh Abdurrahman al-Shaghuri and he told him, study the Ajrumiyah. He says, what do I do next? He says, study it again. He says, then what do I do next? He gave him, there's a very brief commentary on the Ajrumiyah, which is barely longer than Ajrumiyah, by Zaini Dahlan. He says, study that. And he said, while it helped me build my grammar, it also sort of served the purpose of deflating my ego a little bit, because Arabic studying of grammar is not very self-satisfying. So the purpose of usul al-fiqh is to understand textual interpretation. And it's important. Now, at one level, the only person who needs usul al-fiqh is the mujtahid. Right? Because the one who directly derives legal meanings from primary text is the mujtahid. Directly. But understanding textual interpretation, appreciating textual interpretation, being able to judge what is sounder textual interpretation, to assess, whether this meaning is, to be able to appreciate textual interpretation is very important. And it guides sound legal application as well. And when you study usul al-fiqh, this is an investigation. Why do you need usul al-fiqh if the rulings are already derived? But there are many reasons, particularly related to understanding, appreciation, and sound application. And the lack of course, there's a danger in excess with usul al-fiqh, but there's also danger in remissness. There's a lot of very poor and shoddy legal reasoning going around in our times, with people are poorly trained, if trained. And in this, there are texts that are covered, and this is really something that is required beyond the basics, right? Beyond the basics. Like, at the level of studying the basics of the religion, you don't need to study usul al-fiqh, but this is essentials for a student of knowledge. Right? What we were covering in the Foundations of Guidance class is sort of, puff, pre-usul al-fiqh, right? But it's an important puff because it's sort of the puff of guidance, right? It's at the level of essentials. Brief text. The Imam al-Juwayni authored a work called Al-Waraqat. The Hanafis, classically they study, there's different texts that are studied at this level. The Indians and others study this thing called Usul al-Shashi, which neither teacher nor student understand. So it's becomes it's a bad start to a challenging subject. Hanafi usul is much more complicated than the usul of the other madhabs, because Hanafis are much more complicated than the other madhabs. But there's an abridged. Imam al-Nasafi, author of Kanz al-Daqaiq, has a work called Al-Manar, which summarizes many of the great earlier writings in usul al-fiqh in the Hanafi school. But there's more than one mukhtasar of the Manar, abridgment of the Manar, which is facilitative, right, to understand the concepts. And then, in terms of understanding, in the Hanafi school, basic understanding, one would cover the Manar itself or a similar level text. And then there's many commentaries on the Manar, Sharh al-Manar. There's a brilliant Indian scholar called Mullah Jiwan. He wrote this commentary called Nur al-Anwar, which he wrote from memory. He was actually out of India, in the Hijaz. He went for pilgrimage. He remained there, and they asked him to teach usul al-fiqh, because he was a great usuli. But he didn't have any of his books with him, so he wrote it from memory. But he wrote it for the purpose of teaching, and it's ridiculously clear. So they say, "Man lam yafham Nur al-Anwar fahuwa himar." Whoever doesn't understand Nur al-Anwar is a donkey. But it's not that simple. Someone who doesn't understand Nur al-Anwar, having reached it through proper study, like, peace be upon you. But it could come after a while. One of my friends, he's now a mufti, mashallah, he came up and said, "Sidi, I always thought I have bad understanding, but now I know that I'm a donkey." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you mentioned that whoever doesn't understand the Manar is a donkey." I said, "I didn't say it. I said some Indian scholars have said that." He said, "'Cause I don't understand what's going on." I said, "Just give it some time." And there's other commentaries. Al-Haskafi, the author of Durr al-Mukhtar, has a brilliant commentary on the Manar called Ifadatul Anwar. And that used to be the text. Al-Haskafi was from Damascus, and that's the ulama of Damascus used to even till recently, that's what they used to cover. But Al-Haskafi, treated ink as a precious commodity, and so he wrote in a very terse style. So those who like that approach would say it makes you more intelligent. Those who don't would say you won't understand it. Ibn Abdin wrote a commentary on this. It's a wonderful work. And there's many other great commentaries. The Manar was part of the classical curricula for a long time. There's many, many commentaries. Ibn Malik has a commentary on it that the Iraqis still teach actively, and others. But to study, at the minimum, if one's a student now, to cover one sort of more complete work of usul, like the Manar. The Shafi'is, Shaykh al-Islam Zakir Ansari has a work called Lubbul Usul. But there's many other texts at that kind of level, amongst them Al-Luma' of Ash-Shirazi. Now, I'm classically inclined. There's many who incorporate some modern books for facilitation. Some just replace classical texts with modern texts. But classical texts were written with the assumption or the hope that the human being is the rational animal. So reasoning is there. They have the capacity and capability to reason. So reasoning, thinking is assumed. The modern texts are written with the assumption that the human being is merely an animal that can think. So thinking and understanding is neither assumed nor expected. So they dumb everything down. But the danger is that you come out of the whole experience, sad. Right? Which is, simply, you're simply a dumb person, right? Like you're still you've covered all these things, but you haven't developed the capacity, the capacity to think, the capacity to reason. But the modern books are useful because one, they give respond to a lot of modern challenges and so on, and they simplify things that are difficult. So, but certainly at least the way of my teachers and other scholars that I respect is that the modern books taken in small discerning doses, the right books, because there are a lot of bad modern books too, is that they're useful to clarify concepts, to contextualize, etc., but only by very selectively and only by authorities. Just because there's a modern book on a topic, be very wary, confirm, is this worth reading? And then mastery of usul al-fiqh, in Hanafi fiqh, at-tawdih with its super commentary, at-talwih by at-Taftazani, who we'll see in balagha, in many other sciences. At-Taftazani is a big deal in the Islamic sciences, even in mantiq. And in theology, Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya is by Taftazani. So in many classical curricula, about 30 to 40% of the books that are studied are by Taftazani. It's pretty amazing. Even in Sarf. But he has a Sharh on al-Izzi. But it's definitely for intelligent people, or for those who become intelligent. And in Shafi'i fiqh, Jam'ul Jawami', which is a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant work. The Hanafis came up with cognates of that. And there's many other works that are comprehensive. in classical Indian curriculum, they had a book called Musallam al-Thubut by Muhibbullah al-Bihari. And they say, Yusallam liman atqana al-musallam. We concede and defer to the one who has mastered the musallam. And it has a book called Fawatih al-Rahamut ala Musallam al-Thubut, and other. And Indians have some cool titles. They have asked you, there's notes on Musallam al-Thubut called Mafatih al-Buyut, the keys to the houses. But there's many works at this sort of advanced level. But the key always is to consolidate the essentials. If one's a student knowledge, at least to do something at the level of understanding, and to consolidate one's understanding until that understanding is solid, and not to go to the larger texts until, in terms of formal study, one may refer to them for particular issues, etc., for research, but to consolidate one's core. That's usul al-fiqh. We'll continue, inshallah, in the third session by looking at the remaining sciences, which are usul al-hadith, and then ulum al-Qur'an. I hope you're taking notes on this, and prophetology, and then tasawwuf, and then the instrumental sciences, nahu, which is quite a bit of work, and then sarf and balagha, which the fuqaha would say is a waste of time, because ultimately you have to act on God's command, not just stand around appreciating how beautiful it is, but it's important. Mantiq, and so on. So we have one more session to look at the remaining sciences. Any questions here?
The word study is used quite frequently with studying the texts and such.
Yeah.
When you talk about hadith, for example, especially with understanding more mastery level, or even fiqh, for example, what's the understanding of the term study there? What does it mean? How, to what extent do you have to know?
Yeah. I mean, in the ideal world, one would study everything in depth. But the reality is that إن العلوم لا تسع العمر, right? Or العمر, depending on how you look at it. The sciences, are vaster than a lifetime. Or a lifetime is too small for the vastness of knowledge, depending on how you look at it. Which is why they generally say to become a master, to become a person of knowledge takes 40 years. To become a person of knowledge takes 40 years. Right? To become an educated person is a lifetime endeavor. Because it will be someone who's gone through. And all of these things one goes through again and again. Sheikh Hamza talks about a lot in terms of the Western canon. But this, and with his father, for example, his father, rereads all of Shakespeare. Used to reread all of Shakespeare, rahimahullah. He had a routine of how he reviewed, even though he'd studied all the works of Shakespeare. So that's a personal commitment. Imam Abu Hanifa considered it. He disliked for any scholar to be a qadi, to be a judge for more than 4 years. He said, because any subject, if you haven't reviewed thoroughly through teaching, in 4 years you'll forget it. Right? Nuances get lost. Yeah? So someone who'd mastered a subject, if you haven't taught it for 4 years, you'll begin losing it. Right? And that's why they said, never study with anyone who hasn't taught a subject for 4 years. Right? Because unless there's no other alternative, right? Because they won't, knowledge, someone has mumarasa, right? Who's actively engaging in something won't be like someone who studied it way back and they're trying to remember what they studied, right? So that's what, so I'm sure you have a lot more questions, but it's Ustaz Amjad's session now, so you can take 2 minutes to stretch while Ustaz Amjad comes here, and I go away. Um,